The first time I came home after a 12-hour shift and couldn't get into my own driveway. I honestly thought it was a mistake. The second time it happened, I figured it was just a rude neighbor. By the third week, I realized something else entirely. This guy wasn't making a mistake. He was testing me. And the worst part is, for 6 straight months, he thought he had already won. I live in a quiet neighborhood outside a mid-sized town in Oregon, the kind of place where most houses were built sometime in the 70s and people still wave when they pass each other on morning walks. Nothing fancy. No gates, no HOA drama, no million-dollar mansions. Just tree-lined streets, older homes, and neighbors who mostly mind their business. The house I live in used to belong to my grandfather, Walter Briggs. He bought the land long before the area turned into a neighborhood, back when it was mostly fields and logging roads. I inherited it when he passed a few years ago, and honestly, it still feels like I'm just borrowing it from him. I work long shifts at a manufacturing plant about 40 minutes away, and most days when I pull into the street it's already dark, my back hurts, and all I want is to park the truck, go inside, and sit down for 5 minutes before life starts up again. Because these days, it's not just me in the house. My mom lives with me too. She's 73 now, and after my dad passed she moved in so she wouldn't be alone. She still insists she's perfectly capable of doing everything herself, which is half true. But the other half is that carrying groceries across half a block isn't exactly ideal. That's why the driveway matters. It's right next to the front door. It makes life easier. Or at least it used to. The problem started the week a guy named Grant Holloway moved in 3 houses down. Grant was the type of guy you notice immediately, not because he's friendly, but because he carries himself like he owns the air around him. Late 30s, sharp haircut, expensive clothes that somehow look casual and calculated at the same time. The kind of guy who talks loudly on his phone even when nobody's around. The first time I saw him was the day he moved in. A moving truck was parked halfway across the street while Grant stood in the yard giving instructions like a movie director. Careful with that. He snapped at one of the movers. That's imported. I remember thinking, well, this guy's going to be interesting. Turns out I underestimated just how interesting. A couple weeks later, I pulled onto the street after work and immediately saw something wrong. Parked directly across the mouth of my driveway was a brand new silver electric sedan, clean enough to reflect the streetlights like a mirror, blocking the driveway completely. I slowed down, blinked once, then twice, waiting for the owner to pop out of a house or wave apologetically. Nothing, just the car. I parked along the curb and walked over to the house where the moving truck had been weeks earlier. Grant answered the door. He had a drink in one hand, and that mildly annoyed expression people wear when they're interrupted during something they think is more important. Hey, I said, keeping my voice calm. Is that your car out front? He leaned sideways and glanced down the street. Silver one. Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's mine. I nodded toward the driveway. It's blocking my driveway. Grant looked back at me, shrugged, and took a sip from his glass. Well, street parking's pretty tight around here. That was it. No apology. No offer to move it. Just a shrug. I waited a second, thinking maybe he was about to say something else. Instead, he said, I'll move it later. Later turned out to mean the next morning. The next time it happened, I knocked again. Grant opened the door halfway this time. Oh, hey, he said slowly, like he was trying to remember my name even though I hadn't told him. Your car's blocking the driveway again. He looked past me toward the street, then gave that same casual shrug. Didn't realize. Except he clearly had. Because the third time it happened, I found something new. A small note under his windshield wiper. Except it wasn't from me. It was from another neighbor. It read, Please stop blocking driveways. This street isn't your parking lot. I stood there staring at it for a moment and thought, well, I'm clearly not the only one dealing with this guy. So I tried to keep things civil. I wrote my own note. Short and polite. Hey neighbor, please don't block my driveway. My mom needs access to park close to the house. Sign my name. Left it under the wiper. For about a week, things were fine. Then one night, I came home after a double shift. And there it was again. Same car. Same spot. Same casual middle finger to the rest of the street. This time Grant was outside when I walked up. He was leaning against the hood of the car, scrolling on his phone. I stopped a few feet away. You saw the note. He looked up slowly. Oh yeah. And you still parked here. Grant slipped his phone into his pocket and smiled. Not a friendly smile. One of those thin, smug ones that sits crooked on a person's face. Well, he said casually, Technically, I'm parked on the street. I stared at him for a second. You're blocking my driveway. Am I though? He said. Then he looked down at the curb line like a lawyer studying evidence. I mean, your driveway starts there. He pointed to the concrete. My car's out here. That's when I realized something. Grant wasn't just rude. He enjoyed this. The little argument. The tiny power play. I let out a slow breath. Look, man. I work long hours. My mom lives here. I just need the driveway clear. He nodded slowly, like he was pretending to consider it. Then he said something I'll never forget. Sounds like a you problem. He slid into the driver's seat, started the car, and rolled it forward about 3 feet. Just enough to technically clear the driveway. Then he looked out the window and said, almost cheerfully, see? Problem solved. I stood there watching the taillights disappear down the street and felt something settle in my chest. Not anger exactly. Something colder. Because that moment, that smug little grin, that was when I realized this wasn't going to stop. And Grant Holloway had just made a mistake he didn't even realize yet. Because what he didn't know was that my grandfather kept records of everything. And somewhere in the back of an old metal filing cabinet in my basement was a piece of paper that could turn his entire street upside down. And I hadn't thought about it in years. Until that night. The funny thing about old houses is that they remember things you forget. My grandfather used to say that all the time. He'd tap the side of his filing cabinet like it was some kind of vault and say, paper remembers better than people do. At the time, I was a teenager who barely listened. But that night, standing in my kitchen after Grant rolled his car forward those smug 3 feet, something about that old cabinet came back to me. I poured myself a glass of water, sat at the table for a minute, and replayed the moment in my head, his little smile, the shrug, the way he said sounds like a you problem, like it was some clever punchline. And suddenly I remembered something else. My grandfather wasn't just some guy who owned land. He had been a surveyor. The kind of man who spent decades measuring boundaries, mapping property lines, documenting everything down to the inch. Which meant our basement didn't just have junk in it. It had history. I went downstairs around midnight. The basement still smells like it did when I was a kid, dust, old paper, a little bit of motor oil. The filing cabinet was sitting exactly where it had always been, tucked against the wall near the old workbench. For drawers. Heavy steel. I hadn't opened it in years. The bottom drawer stuck for a second when I pulled it, then slid open with that slow metal scrape. Inside were dozens of folders, each one labeled in my grandfather's neat block handwriting. Water rights, boundary surveys, utility easements, old land sales. And then I saw the one that made me pause. A faded manila folder that read, County Road Easement, 1964. I pulled it out and carried it upstairs. At first, I wasn't even sure what I was looking for. I just started flipping through the documents, reading bits and pieces under the kitchen light. Old surveys, hand-drawn maps, stamped county paperwork. The story slowly started piecing itself together. Before the neighborhood existed, before the houses, the sidewalks, the streetlights, my grandfather owned almost the entire stretch of land our street now sits on. Back then it had just been a dirt access road cutting through the property so trucks could reach the logging trails farther out. Years later, when the town expanded, the city approached him about turning that road into a proper residential street, paving it, running utilities, opening it to public traffic. But there was a catch. My grandfather didn't sell the land for the road. He granted the city something called a limited easement, which basically meant the city could use the land for a road, but the ownership underneath still belonged to him. And apparently, that agreement came with conditions. I leaned closer to the page and read the clause twice just to make sure I understood it. The easement remained valid only so long as the road was used strictly for residential access. Any sustained commercial use tied to properties along the easement could be grounds for revocation. I sat back slowly in my chair. At first it sounded almost meaningless. Legal language from 60 years ago. But then another thought crept in. Grant. The guy was always home. And he was always on the phone. Always pacing his yard talking about clients, markets, deals. I'd seen unfamiliar cars parked along the street almost every weekday. People coming and going during business hours. At the time I figured he just worked remotely like half the country these days. But suddenly I wasn't so sure. The next morning I started paying attention. Really paying attention. And once you start noticing something, you can't stop seeing it. Monday morning around 9, a black SUV pulled up to Grant's house. A guy in a suit got out carrying a laptop bag. He stayed inside for almost an hour. Tuesday afternoon, a different car. Wednesday, 2 more. Thursday, I walked past his yard and noticed something I somehow hadn't really registered before. A small sign near the mailbox. Holloway Strategic Consulting. Clean black lettering. Professional. Subtle, but definitely there. I slowed down and looked at it for a moment. Then I pulled out my phone and took a picture. That weekend, I did something I hadn't done since college. Research. Turns out in this county, business licenses are public records. It took about 20 minutes online to find what I was looking for. Holloway Strategic Consulting, LLC. Registered business address. Grant Holloway's house. Right there on my street. My stomach did that slow tightening thing you feel when an idea begins forming into something real. Still, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. So Monday morning, I drove down to a small property law office in town. The place looked exactly how you'd expect a local attorney's office to look. Framed certificates on the wall, old wooden desk, shelves full of thick legal books nobody probably reads anymore. The lawyer's name was Elaine Porter. Late 50s, sharp eyes, calm voice. The kind of person who listens more than she talks. I laid the folder on her desk and explained the situation. The driveway, the car, the note, Grant's little smirk. She flipped through the documents slowly, reading each page with careful attention. After about 10 minutes, she leaned back in her chair. Well, she said thoughtfully, this is interesting. Interesting good or interesting bad? She smiled slightly. Potentially interesting expensive for your neighbor. That got my attention. Elaine tapped the easement clause with a pen. Your grandfather was very thorough. He always was. She nodded. If this document is still enforceable, and if the road is technically being used to support a commercial business. She paused. Then the easement could be challenged. I frowned. Challenged how? Well, she said, revocation would be the extreme scenario. And that means what exactly? She looked at me over her glasses. It means, legally speaking, the city would no longer have the right to maintain that road. I blinked. So what happens then? In theory, she folded her hands together. The land reverts back to the property owner. My brain took a second to catch up. You mean me? Elaine nodded once. In theory. That word hung in the air. Theory. Legal possibilities. Old documents. It all sounded a little crazy. But she wasn't done. The bigger issue, she continued, would be access. Access. If the easement disappears, properties that rely on that road for entry could suddenly find themselves without legal access. I thought about Grant's house sitting right in the middle of the block. No alley behind it. No side road. Just that single street. Elaine must have seen the realization hit my face because she raised a hand. Let's be clear, she said calmly. This kind of thing rarely escalates that far. Why? Because once lawyers start talking, people tend to settle quickly. I sat there quietly for a moment. Part of me felt like this was overkill. Like bringing a cannon to a parking dispute. But then I pictured my mom carrying grocery bags down the block. I pictured Grant's smile. Sounds like a you problem. I looked back at Elaine. What would it take to test it? She leaned forward slightly. Evidence. Of what? Commercial activity tied to the property. Clients visiting. Advertising. Business registration. Traffic patterns. Anything showing the street is being used to support a business operation. I exhaled slowly. Well, and I slid my phone across the desk. Pictures of the sign. Pictures of cars parked outside. Screenshots of the business listing. Elaine studied them quietly. Then she gave a small nod. This might actually work. The next 2 weeks felt like I was suddenly living inside some strange legal documentary. I took photos. Logged dates. Noted when cars arrived and left. A few of the other neighbors started talking to me once word got around. Turns out Grant hadn't just been blocking my driveway. He'd been blocking others too. Sometimes clients would park halfway across sidewalks. One neighbor said Grant regularly took loud business calls outside at 7 in the morning. Another mentioned unfamiliar cars speeding down the street all the time. Nobody liked confrontation, so most people had just tolerated it. Until now. Elaine assembled everything into a formal filing. One afternoon she called me. All right, she said. We're submitting the petition. Now. What happens next? Well, she said calmly. If the judge agrees there's sufficient cause, the city will be notified. And Grant? He'll find out soon enough. 3 days later, Elaine called again. Her voice sounded almost amused. You might want to come home early tonight. Why? Because the judge signed the order. I pulled my truck onto the street around 6 that evening. and the first thing I saw were the cones. Bright orange traffic cones blocking the entrance to the road. 2 city vehicles parked nearby, and a sheriff's deputy standing beside them. For a second, I just sat there behind the wheel, processing, because suddenly, the quiet little street I'd lived on my whole life looked very different. And about halfway down the block, Grant Holloway was standing in his driveway, holding a stack of papers, looking like someone had just dropped a piano on his afternoon. And the night was only getting started. When I stepped out of the truck that evening, the whole street had that strange, quiet energy you get right before something big happens. Not loud, not chaotic, just tense. The kind of quiet where people are watching from windows. Front doors cracked open. Neighbors pretending to water plants a little longer than usual. Because the second those orange cones appeared at the entrance of the road, word started traveling faster than the internet. And at the center of it all stood Grant Holloway. He was halfway down the block in his driveway, holding a stack of papers like they had personally insulted him. The sheriff's deputy stood a few feet away, calm as could be, one hand resting on his belt. I walked up slowly, not trying to make a scene. Grant saw me almost immediately. Our eyes locked, and for the first time since I'd met him, that smug little smile was gone. He looked confused, then angry, then something else. The kind of expression people get when they realize a situation they thought they controlled has suddenly gotten very real. He waved the papers in the air. "What the hell is this?" he snapped, loud enough for half the street to hear. The deputy spoke before I could. "Sir, these are official documents issued by the county court." Grant turned toward him. "Yeah, I can read. That doesn't explain why my street is blocked." The deputy stayed perfectly calm. "The road is currently under temporary restriction while the easement dispute is reviewed." Grant blinked. "Easement dispute?" Then his eyes slid back to me, and you could practically see the moment it clicked. "You," he said slowly. I shrugged a little. "Evening, Grant." The silence that followed felt almost theatrical. He stepped closer. "You did this." I tilted my head. "Did what?" He shook the papers again. "Don't play dumb." Now, normally, I'm not the type who enjoys confrontation. But something about that moment, 6 months of driveway games, my mom hauling groceries, the notes ignored, the smirk. Well, let's just say my patients had already packed up and moved out. "I filed paperwork," I said calmly. "With the court." Grant laughed once. Short and sharp. "You're kidding." "Nope." He looked back at the deputy. "This is ridiculous. You can't just close a public street." The deputy shrugged slightly. "Court order says otherwise." Grant stared down the road like maybe it would magically reopen if he glared hard enough. Then he turned back to me again. "This is about parking?" I leaned against my truck. "No." A pause. "This is about consequences." That didn't land well. Grant stepped closer again, lowering his voice. "You think this is funny?" "No. Because my lawyer's going to destroy this." "Maybe. And when that happens," he said, pointing the papers at my chest, "you're going to look like the biggest idiot in this town." I considered that for a second. Then I said something that made him freeze. "You should probably tell your clients not to come by tomorrow." His forehead creased. "What?" "The road's closed." That was the moment the situation fully landed on him. His house sat right in the middle of the block. No side alley. No back entrance. Just one road. The road now blocked by cones and a sheriff's deputy. Grant turned slowly and looked down the street. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked nervous. Over the next couple days, things got interesting. First came the city. 2 engineers showed up the next morning, walking the length of the road with clipboards while talking quietly. Then came Grant's lawyers. 3 of them, actually. Black sedans. Serious expressions. One afternoon, I saw them standing in his driveway flipping through documents while Grant paced like a man waiting for surgery. Meanwhile, the rest of the neighborhood started treating the whole situation like a live television show. Mrs. Alvarez across the street baked cookies and brought them over one night. "I'm not saying you're a hero," she said, handing me the container. "But I am saying I haven't enjoyed watching something this much since the Super Bowl." Another neighbor told me Grant's clients had already gotten confused trying to reach the house. Apparently, one guy parked 2 streets over and walked around for 15 minutes before giving up. Deliveries started bouncing back. Mail stopped showing up. Utility workers came by once, took one look at the legal notice posted at the road entrance, and quietly drove away. The whole thing felt surreal. Grant, meanwhile, looked like a man slowly discovering gravity. Day 1 he was furious. Day 3 he was making phone calls nonstop. Day 5 he knocked on my door. I opened it and found him standing there in a wrinkled button-down shirt, eyes tired, jaw tight. For a moment we just looked at each other. Then he said something I never expected to hear from him. "We should talk." I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. "Sure." Grant rubbed the back of his neck. "Look, this situation is unnecessary." I nodded slowly. "Is it?" "Yes," he said quickly. "Whatever your problem is with me, we can solve it without shutting down an entire street." I crossed my arms. "My driveway's been blocked for 6 months." He waved that off. "That's not what this is about." No, he said impatiently. "This is about you trying to make some kind of point." I looked at him carefully. "Grant, do you know how many times I asked you to move the car?" He didn't answer. "You remember the notes?" Silence. "The conversations?" Still nothing. Then finally he sighed. "Fine. Maybe I was inconsiderate." "Inconsiderate? Look, man," he snapped, irritation slipping back in. "I run a business. Clients come and go. Parking gets tight. That's why you used my driveway. I parked on the street. You blocked the driveway." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time since we'd started talking, Grant looked like he was running out of arguments. Then he said something different. "What do you want?" The question hung there in the cool evening air. Honestly, I had thought about that a lot, because this whole thing had never really been about revenge. It was about respect and boundaries, and the simple idea that people shouldn't get to treat their neighbors like obstacles. I took a slow breath. "Your business moves." Grant blinked. "What?" "You've got 30 days to relocate it somewhere else." "That's insane." "Second," I continued calmly, "you sign a written agreement guaranteeing my driveway stays clear." He stared at me. "And third," I paused, "you pay a yearly access fee." Grant actually laughed. "You're joking." "No, this road is public." "Not exactly." He looked like he wanted to argue that point, but something in those legal papers must have convinced him otherwise, because instead he just stood there silently, processing. A long minute passed. Finally, he exhaled slowly. "You've been waiting to say that." "Yeah," I admitted. Another pause. Then Grant did something surprising. He nodded once. "All right." That caught me off guard. "All right. My lawyer said settling would probably be cheaper than fighting the easement." He looked down the street toward the cones. "And frankly, I'm tired of parking 3 blocks away." For the first time in this entire saga, we both almost smiled. The paperwork took about 2 weeks to finalize. Grant moved his consulting business to an office downtown. The agreement was signed. The yearly access fee was filed with the county. And one bright Saturday morning, the cones disappeared. The street reopened. Life went back to normal. These days when I pull into the neighborhood after work, my driveway is always clear. My mom parks right next to the front door again. And Grant, well, he still lives down the street. But he never parks anywhere near my driveway. In fact, he waves now. Just a quick little nod when we pass each other. Like two people who both learned something the hard way. And honestly, sometimes I wonder if I went too far. Shutting down a street over a parking dispute sounds pretty extreme when you say it out loud. But then I remember something my grandfather used to tell me. "Respect your neighbors," he'd say. Because property lines aren't just about land, they're about boundaries. So now I'm curious what you think. Did I overreact? Or was this exactly the kind of lesson someone like Grant needed? Let me know in the comments, because stories like this always seem to split people right down the middle. And if you enjoy real neighborhood drama where actions actually have consequences, make sure you subscribe. Trust me, this wasn't the only strange thing that ever happened on this street.